Dr. Alex Lupi from Paris, France. My name is Mike Wang from Edmonton, Canada. We're starting the last day of the Banff meeting, and traditionally for the last 28 years, the last day Friday has been a summary of what happened at the meeting. And I think almost 30 years ago, when the meeting was with 11 people, several days in one room, the summary was a slightly easier task to where we have come now with several parallel organ sessions in a large meeting. And therefore, I would like to thank all speakers in advance to trying to summarize what happened during this week, and will set direction for where our field is going over the next 2 years. So the first summary is traditionally the kidney, because of course the kidney is where everything goes through, and then the liver. So we have a kind of a hierarchy in Banff, I think. But Dr. Mark Haas from Cedars-Sinai is summarizing what happened in the kidney field at this meeting. So thank you very much, Mark.
First of all, it's been a pleasure. Glad to see everybody up early, and I want to especially thank those people who responded to the questionnaire last night after they got back from shaking on the dance floor. And I'm going to basically, what I'm going to limit this summary to primarily is some of the unanswered questions that we have with the Banff kidney classification, and sort of the early attempts to try and resolve some of these things. And, particularly the classification that has given us the most confusion so far has been the TCMR classification. Some of the thresholds that we now have, and some confusing aspects of the definition and diagnosis of chronic active TCMR. So I'm going to address some of these questions in order. The first of which is has to do with the reporting of chronic active TCMR, and do we want to report just simply as the 2017 classification listed, the diagnosis of chronic active TCMR, or if there's an active component present, do we want to specify that and report it separately in the diagnosis line? So again, one leading to two. Just to briefly remind you of some of the data that came out of this meeting, that there has actually, in fact, been some preliminary studies of the responses of this lesion to steroids, in particular, and other immunosuppressive therapy. And it's actually true in the combined data from Cedars-Sinai and from the University of Pittsburgh that a small majority of these patients do, in fact, respond with either a complete or partial response to therapy. Yes, the error. And, but that it seems to be, at least based on a small number of cases, those that have an active lesion as a component of this, as indicated by an I score greater than 0, that seem to have this response. So in light of this, we asked, you have a biopsy that has interstitial inflammation in scarred and non-scarred areas, as well as tubulitis. In this case, the non-scarred would meet a criterion for a borderline infiltrate. How would you like to grade that? And at this point, the majority actually say that they should specify both the chronic active and the active component. And so reporting chronic active TCMR grade 1A and borderline or suspicious for acute TCMR. And if this, in fact, meets criteria for both active and chronic active 1A to report both the active and the chronic active components. Again, this is based on about 20 responses so far. There's still quite a few to come in, but this sort of double reporting seemed to be the preferred thing, especially since I suppose that the nephrologists would prefer to see that there is in fact an active lesion here comprising the chronic active. An unresolved question that a couple of people pointed out that was not clear in 2017 was, do we discriminate between tubulitis in areas of IFTA and IFTA and in non-scarred areas? My interpretation of Banff 2017 is that when one considers tubulitis, that this is over the entire biopsy, not just tubulitis in areas of IFTA. We'll try to make that clear in the 2019 report. What do we do when we have vascular lesions present with chronic active TCMR 1A or 1B? So now we have a lesion that has an active intimal arteritis, a V1 lesion together with chronic active. And at this point, again, the majority felt that reporting of the active lesion, the grade 2A active acute TCMR, should be in the diagnosis line together with the chronic active lesion. When the vascular lesion is more of sort of a chronic lesion, then people simply at this point felt that didn't really distinguish between this, but importantly pointed out that there seemed to be that the borderline lesion should be included in the diagnosis line since this is the active lesion. There was a question of whether we want to consider including or excluding the subcapsular cortex in the total inflammation score. When Michael Mingle first reported the total inflammation score, this was over the entire cortex, did not specifically exclude the subcapsular cortex, but other measures of inflammation, according to Banff, have excluded the subcapsular cortex. So do we want to do so also for the total inflammation score? Right now, we can see in the middle point at this point about equal numbers of yes and no. So no real need to change this at this point. Another point that came out of the studies primarily of Brian Nangavel was Banff is somewhat confusing because different iterations of Banff give different thresholds for inflammation in diagnosing a borderline lesion. The original 1997 criteria said you have to have inflammation in at least 10% of the non-scarred cortex. That is an I1 lesion. Some subsequent iterations accepted lesser degrees of inflammation, less than 10%, or I0. The majority at this point, based on Brian's data, which supports this, is that inflammation should go back to the original 1997 criteria and threshold, and that is that at least 10% of the non-scarred cortex should be inflamed in order to diagnose borderline. Whether we want to change the threshold for acute TCMR 1A, that I think is although there's some evidence that a lower threshold might be indicated there as well, I think that's a subject for 2021. And finally, should there be minimum CI and CT, or the amount of IFTA, in diagnosing chronic active TCMR? Right now, the diagnosis, TCMR, is based only on total inflammation, eye, IFTA, and tubulitis. Now, having an eye IFTA score of at least 2 implies, although it does not directly state, that you have to have at least mild IFTA. Less than 10% IFTA is an eye IFTA score of 0 by definition. So the implication of the current criteria is that you have to have at least CI1 and CT1. Some people have suggested raising this to CI2, CT2, or moderate IFTA, and others have suggested simply stating right out that you have to have at least CI1 and CT1. At this point, most people have favored keeping the current definition, either specifying that you have to have at least CI1 or CT1, or just keeping the current definition as is, without a great deal of support for raising this to CI2 and CT2. What is the best threshold for transplant glomerulopathy? We heard Bob Colvin's talk yesterday that when one studies morphometrically at 100, in slide scan at 100x, that it is extremely rare to get a diagnosis of CG0 according to the current criteria. That is no double contours. And that the vast majority of the cases, if you look hard enough, will at least show a few double contours. So should we raise the CG threshold back to 10%, as it was in the original Banff classification, or keep it at the current 0, or go somewhere in the middle, such as 5%? And at this point, I would say that there's no clear consensus on this, but at least as many people favor keeping it at the current level than changing this, simply because I don't think people really look for double contours at 100x magnification, and that the magnifications we look at it, they tend to be less apparent. And what is the best wording for a diagnosis of chronic active antibody-mediated rejection? Should the diagnosis line specify, that should be, or semi-quantitate activity and chronicity, or is simply giving this diagnosis enough at present? So as I said, the threshold for double contours, with about 20% of the vote in, is that probably the majority seem to favor keeping it where it is from Banff 2013 and not raising it back, but all the votes need to be counted. And then with regard to the wording of a diagnosis, most people felt, about 60%, felt that the activity and chronicity should in fact be specified in the diagnosis line, such as calling this ABMR with mild, moderate, or severe activity and mild, moderate, or severe chronicity, and then include in the report text or in a table the actual indices, the CG, PTC, G indices. About another 1/3 felt that this activity and chronicity index, activity and chronicity is simply apparent from the indices and doesn't need to be included in the diagnosis line, although I would personally maintain that not every nephrologist out there that we report diagnoses to fully understands the meaning of G3, PTC3, CG3, etc. And at least at this point, I think a majority of people seem to agree that specifying the level of activity and the level of chronicity makes it clearer for the nephrologist to know if they're dealing with a primarily active lesion or a primarily chronic lesion and treat accordingly. And finally, we had some discussions yesterday about the polyomavirus classification, and Dr. Nicolai presented some validation studies of the polyoma classification and suggested that a polyoma score be added to the Banff indices, so a PVL, which indicates the level of involvement in terms of the amount of cortex involved, or a PVN, which is a composite score, to the other indices such as G, PT, CT, etc. And at this point, people felt that adding the PVL score, which is an estimate of the amount of involved cortex by, or the amount of involved tissue by the viral stain, should be added as a Banff index, although about 25% want to see more evidence for this. And so with that, I can take some questions. This is actually PNC Park in Pittsburgh. It is the baseball stadium. It's a very nice stadium that has a view of the skyline of Pittsburgh in the background, and did manage to catch a game while I was here. That was fun. Thanks.
Thank you, Warren. Before raise questions, who did you send? Did everybody get the survey?
No.
We have no survey
I
system
sent it to about 100 people, everyone who put their email address
on the list.
on the list. There were about 5 that came back, because I guess I couldn't read them.
Okay, so people feel that they had a chance to provide input?
Not enough time to, for everybody to.
Yeah, okay, that wasn't bad by stick by
Yeah,
10 when you sent it out, right?
it was sent out about 9:30 last night,
Yeah.
after which time I went to the dance. But I wanted to get that out, at least to give some people a chance, so I would actually have something to.
But okay, there's still open, no
Yeah,
decisions
it's
made.
still open, and all the votes will be counted.
So are there other questions? Do you have a deadline, Mark? Yeah, it's the next Banff meeting. Yeah.
I would very much like to receive the responses by
I
the
would
end
ask
of
if
the
you
week.
could distribute this slide set via the same email list.
Okay, so this slide, are you giving consent to share your slides?
Yeah, this summary can certainly be shared. I've been asked by about 7 people already.
Okay.
And I will send it to them.
Yeah, we get Kim with his internet magic too.
Yeah,
Yep, I'll do it.
This is good.
very good.
So I have a question with this PVN. Do we have to state the PVL or PVN score when you're not doing an SV40 stain on every biopsy? Technically, I thought you can, because also seeing inclusions by light microscopy does count towards that score.
At our center, we do state a PVL score, which is the extent one can calculate the PVN score from the PVL score and the CI score.
And you do that without having an SV40 stain?
And we will do that without having an SV40 stain, but obviously if we see any inclusions, we will always do an SV40 stain. And in fact, if I have IFTA, I will always do an SV40 stain. So the only time I'll report a PVL of 0 is either one with a negative stain, and if I don't do the stain, it's a very pristine biopsy.
I was wondering, Mark, since you mentioned, Maria Pinheiro, Chicago, since you mentioned that you have your own table, could we maybe come up with a sort of generic table and choices 0 to 3, NA not applicable, stuff like that, so we all can use? Currently, I give the scoring in the comment field, right? I give a line diagnosis and the sort of details in the comment field. But maybe having the table will make it more uniform, and whatever one does not use, we just put NA, not applicable.
I can send Kim a copy of our table, and
Yep.
he can
That would be great.
do his internet magic.
So you're desiring a Banff synoptic For the,
Yeah.
which is standardized.
So we
kind of.
have a
Yeah,
table of
standardized,
12
right.
indices at the end of our report.
And I
And
think,
simply, we actually have a form, and we write in the numbers, and then our lab assistant just fills in that at the end of the report.
if we have it standardized,
Yeah.
then we can much easier pull the data and then prepare it for the next meeting.
So I think that question perfectly aligns with one of the conclusions I think made yesterday about the need of, for using the semantics and terminology. And I think it also echoes the Banff 101 initiative. So there is like a push, and I presented some aspect of that during the pre-meeting, that we could actually digitalize the rules and build some kind of interfaces. That's going to be a V1, but you will have basically all the lesions that you can score and some kind of automated report that you can check afterwards. So we try to have more homogeneity in the way all diagnoses are reported. And I think that maybe those kind of interfaces that echo the Banff 101 paper will be in the future useful for the Banff community. So it will definitely, that point will be covered, I think, in the Banff report, because this is really important.
I think that, right now, we give the table. We don't actually have a comment reporting what these indices mean, but perhaps a small paragraph after the table actually explaining what the indices are would also be helpful, and I can put something like that together.
Kind of a footnote.
Kind of a footnote, and so, so for example, so that people know, it might say, CG3, but not everyone knows what CG3 is, but this would say severe severe transplant glomerulopathy, most often a marker of chronic avian lung.
I would be good to have uniformity, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We get it.
Yes.
T-shirt next time. You all have to wear it. Okay.
With a lightning bolt was sent?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.